From death threats on social media to the child exploitation scandal in Rotherham, violence against women and girls is rarely out of the news. With the election in May fast approaching, politicians are beginning to recognise that this is a major issue that needs to be addressed. Ahead of the election, we spoke to Sarah Green of the End Violence Against Women Coalition about what political parties need to do to address the problem.
Since 2010 in Britain, there has been a lot of attention to violence against women and girls and to how women and girls can better be kept safe and better be protected from sexual violence, domestic violence, forced marriage and FGM. These issues have definitely come right up the agenda. There have been some really sound moves. So this government, the Conservative and Liberal Democrat governments here, have looked at and acted on forced marriage and on FGM. There have been new moves around domestic violence. There have, however, because of the so-called austerity cuts, been some really serious cuts to women's specialist services. So in local communities all over Britain, refuges where women and their children often need to flee if they are getting out of a violent relationship, and also rape crisis centres have been subject to some very serious cuts.
The closure of domestic violence refuges is facing a crisis. Across the UK, more and more are closing, leaving abused women and children with no safe place to go.
What our coalition and lots of women's organisations who work directly with victims and survivors of abuse are saying to the political parties now is, we recognise that you have paid a lot more attention to these issues. We need to see real concerted action to prevent abuse happening in the first place. First of all, we must have compulsory sex and relationships education in our schools so that from a young age we are talking to young people about the acceptable lines in relationships, about how adults who respect each other do and do not treat each other. The second crucial measure, which we would press the next government to do, is to look urgently at the funding of specialist women's services in the community. Those services have been at risk and some have closed over this term of government. We need urgently to look at a national funding solution and at how we ensure they stay open.
According to Ofsted, 40% of our classrooms are not keeping up. Parliament is lagging behind. The latest guidance on sex and relationships education was produced 14 years ago by the Department for Education, before Facebook was even conceived. So why do we need to improve and update education about sex and relationships?
As we sit here in 2015, we are already in like a totally changed media landscape from 2010, the time of the last election. Social media platforms and so on, and the way that young people use them between themselves and so on, has utterly transformed. New technologies are used routinely between younger people and adults to share revenge pornography images, for example. Sexting is known to be extremely prevalent in schools, and those who've studied it report that it isn't casual activity, that it is extremely gendered, that it involves boys usually pressuring girls for images and persisting. This government, for example, has fairly quickly recognised and legislated around revenge pornography. We might want to see, for example, some similar action on really looking at the way that abuse on social media is tolerated and policed. One of the solutions being compulsory sex and relationships education in an age-appropriate way from an early age, that we can always be talking with boys and girls about equality in relationships and about how people who love each other and care about each other really do treat each other.